I am honored to be joined by leading broadcast journalist and author Ray Suarez. Ray is a visiting professor of political science at the New York University Shanghai and the host of the podcast World Affairs. Ray Suarez was the host of Inside Story on Al Jazeera America, the chief national correspondent and anchor of PBS NewsHour, and the host of Talk of the Nation on NPR. Ray Suarez is also the author of 3 books, including Latino Americans, the 500-year legacy that shaped a nation, which details the story of Hispanic Americans in the United States through key chapters of American history, including the early European settlements, the Great Depression, and the Civil Rights Movement. Ray Suarez, many thanks for joining us. Gracias por acompañarnos.
It's got a pleasure.
Thank you. I want to start a conversation by asking what Hispanic Heritage Month means to you and why it is so important that we celebrate it.
Well, there wasn't such a thing when I was a kid, and growing up in New York, in a very Caribbean milieu, you didn't really get the whole picture of the hemisphere, the way Americans really have to now. Who's here changed over the decades. So I guess what it means to me is increased presence and a hope that now that we're about a fifth of the population of the United States, that the rest of the country will pay a little bit more attention and understand our long story in the United States.
You were born in Brooklyn, New York in the late 1950s to Puerto Rican parents. At the time, the culturally vibrant and rapid-growing barrios in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Bronx were the new home for thousands of Puerto Rican migrants. How did your background help you to find your passion for journalism, and how did it later influence your interest in the very complex story of Hispanic Americans in the United States?
Well, to be honest, it felt a little bit like a long shot when I was young. I decided I wanted to be a reporter in junior high, but at that point, in the late 60s and early 70s, there were very few examples of people making it in mainstream journalism from the Latino community. There were a few, and they were heroes of mine, and I paid attention to their work and wondered if I would be able to get over. It was not feeling very promising when I was a young guy. And certainly when I went to New York University, there weren't very many Latinos there at the time either. I used to joke that we could have held the meetings of the Latino Students Association in a phone booth. I was very active with the radio station and the student newspaper, and those both gave me a grounding in journalism that put a rudder on my boat, put wheels on my car, and got me out the door of college and into the news business. And New York was a great place to start because it was one of the main headquarters of American communications, even more then than it is now. And, I started to climb the ladder from the bottom as a copy boy.
In your book, you describe how Spanish was the first European language spoken in what is now the United States. And you also describe how the earliest land titles given in these lands were granted to Spanish families. Can you please tell us more about these early chapters of American history, which sometimes seem forgotten?
In my book, I ask the reader to think about American history in a very different way. When you go to school from kindergarten to 12th grade in the United States, you learn about fortune hunters in Jamestown in Virginia. You learn about religious dissenters and refugees in New England, in Plymouth, who came on the Mayflower. But you don't really hear about San Agustin. You don't hear about El Paso del Norte. You don't hear about the chain of missions in California that became many of the biggest cities in the United States. You get a version of history that's very English and not multinational. And really, this North America was a stage on which 3 great empires were playing out their power struggle in Europe on a new territory. It's like they came to a new pitch to play a championship match. The French, the English, and the Spanish were all bumping up against each other and seizing land and dealing with native tribes and also keeping an eye on each other. And places like Louisiana, places like western Pennsylvania and the Ohio River Valley were really great power conflict zones as the French and the English, as the French and the Spanish tried to put stakes in the ground and make a permanent claim on the territory of that became the United States. And really to remember that Spanish was the first European language spoken in what's now the United States is to remember that St. Augustine, Florida was already a fairly well-built town with an administration and streets and shops and houses long before anybody jumped off the ship and talked to native tribes in what's now Jamestown, Virginia, long before 1620, when pilgrims finished their journey from Holland and England and set foot in what became the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Spanish history is older and really deserves a little bit more attention than it gets in the way history is taught in our schools.
When the United States entered the Second World War, thousands of Hispanic Americans, many of them born in different parts of the Spanish-speaking world, were sent abroad to fight for their newly adopted country. Can you tell us more about this period, about the unknown Hispanic American heroes of the time, including Macario Garcia, and the challenges they faced when they came back home?
You know, a lot of people don't realize that one of the seeds that became the Latino civil rights movement was really service in World War II. Those GIs came back from the war, having fought to end fascism in Europe, having fought to end brutal dictatorship in East Asia, back to a country that did not grant them equal rights, that wasn't interested in their claim on public goods like seats in public universities, places in newly built public housing projects that were rising in the cities that had very tiny vacancy rates because housing hadn't been built for many years through wartime shortages and then through the privations of the Great Depression in the 1930s. So they came home wanting to start families, wanting to get going on adult lives that they had postponed for years, and found that in many cases they were just as unwelcome as they were before they put on the uniform and went to basic training. You mentioned Macario Garcia. He's a perfect story. He's Mexican-born, became a naturalized American through his service in the Army in World War II, and became the first Mexican-born man to win the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration for valor that our armed forces give, pinned onto him, put around his neck by President Harry Truman when he came back from the war. When he goes back to his hometown of Sugar Land, Texas, outside Houston, he's denied service in a local cafe because they say, we don't serve Mexicans here. And he was so angry. A Medal of Honor winner who had been to Washington and had his decoration put around his neck by the president, who had fought valiantly and been wounded terribly in the Italian campaign. And now he can't get served in a cafe in his hometown. He started a fist fight and was arrested by police. The police didn't arrest the man who wouldn't serve him or the man who fought him in the cafe. They arrested him. And his story was taken up by outside press services. So, decorated war hero denied service in a cafe. And he became something of a cause celeb, something of bad publicity for Houston, Texas, and got an apology and eventually got a local elementary school in Sugar Land named after him.
In the early 1960s, the harsh labor conditions experienced by farm workers in the fields of California led Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta to launch a nonviolent crusade for equality. Tell us more about the significance of this period, which marked a new era of Hispanic political participation in the United States.
The story of the United Farm Workers is really, in many ways, a microcosm of the Hispanic civil rights movement writ large. And I'll tell you why. As a pair, Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez were very different people. She was a woman who had trained as a teacher, but was so turned off by the injustices she saw in the farm communities where she worked as an elementary school teacher that she started to support worker rights. Cesar Chavez's family lost everything in the Great Depression. They had achieved a certain level of middle-class comfort only to see it all evaporated by the tremendous economic setbacks being experienced all over the country. And he worked as a field hand after his family lost their store, lost their home, lost their property. He served in the Navy and came back to California and saw the injustices being experienced by a mix of native-born itinerant labor, Mexican immigrants who were living in California, and importantly for this story, also Filipino workers who were very present in the fields. So this becomes a multi-ethnic, a cross-ethnic civil rights movement, because you got to make coalitions if you want to win some of these battles. And it wasn't a Mexican-only movement. And, you know, Cesar Chavez, interestingly, said, I'm not a Mexican leader. I'm a labor leader. And he fought for workers' rights, and paradoxically, to many people, and suspiciously to some people, he was very resistant to continued flows of labor across the border from Mexico, because he knew that that undermined the cost of labor. He knew that that dissolved, eroded the workers' power to demand a living wage from the growers in California. So he was staunch against the landowners bringing in strike breakers, bringing in day laborers from Mexico to work in the fields. So people say, well, what kind of hero is this? What kind of leader is this? He was against Mexican immigrants. What kind of example is he? And again, I'll go back to that. He said, I am not a Mexican leader. I am a labor leader, and I work for my workers. It was a very hard fought, in some cases brutal, in some cases fatal set of encounters with the landowners. And it showed the organizing strength and savvy of Dolores Huerta, who helped take the campaign for the United Farm Workers nationwide. You know, in Brooklyn, in Chicago, in Miami, we didn't know that much about what was going on in the fields near Delano, California. We just didn't know. It wasn't covered very heavily in other parts of the country. But Dolores Huerta and her allies in these various other cities helped organize the lettuce boycotts, helped organize the grape boycotts that forced the landowners, forced the growers to the table, and helped establish the United Farm Workers.
In your book, you explore the lives of extraordinary Hispanic Americans who helped shape the modern United States. From all the individuals that you explored, which one did you find the most compelling and the most unknown?
Well, one of the stories that was of special importance to me was that of Isabel Gonzalez. Isabel Gonzalez was born in Puerto Rico before the War of 1898, before the United States took the island from Spain in that war and raised the American flag over San Juan Harbor. And she was engaged to a man who was living in New York, another Puerto Rican. She gets on a boat and sails up to New York Harbor shortly after the United States annexes Puerto Rico. And when the boat pulls into New York Harbor, they tell her she's got to get off at Ellis Island, like all the other immigrants, because the boat made stops in other ports of call where foreigners got on in the Caribbean. And she said, no, I don't have to go to Ellis Island. I'm from Puerto Rico, where the United States is now the owning and running the island. So I'm not an immigrant. I'm just moving from one part of the United States to another. They made her get off the boat. They made her go to Ellis Island, and they confined her in Ellis Island. Luckily, her fiancé's family was in contact with the first resident commissioner, the representative in Congress from Puerto Rico, Federico de Getao. And he saw an opportunity to take this up the appellate ladder and establish in law the right of Puerto Ricans to live on the mainland now that the island had been taken by the United States. There's a group of Supreme Court decisions called the insular decisions that have to do with commerce. What do we consider the agricultural products of these various places that are part of our new empire? Are they imports? Are they native produced goods? There were people in the American agricultural trade trying to protect American goods who wanted Puerto Rican products to be considered imports before they landed in the United States and pay a duty. Isabel Gonzalez said, hey, while you guys are arguing over bags of coffee and sugar, we're human beings, and I'm going to fight for our right to come ashore. She eventually comes ashore, but even after it's straightened out and all the red tape is cut, she has her baby in the United States, she continues to fight in federal court. And 2 years after she moves to the United States, her case makes it to the Supreme Court. And in a landmark decision, establishes the right in law of Puerto Ricans to move to the United States. So she's, in some ways, Puerto Rican number one in the United States by making sure, by continuing to fight even after her own personal problem was settled. She's kind of a hero, kind of a feisty, peppery, independent woman, and I was glad to be able to tell her story, a little-known story, even among Puerto Ricans.
We're running out of time, but I want to ask one final question. Where are we going? What does the future look like for Hispanic Americans in the United States?
Well, I have an optimistic American guy answer, and I have a pessimistic sociologist's answer. My optimistic American guy answer is that America will finally get it right, in part out of mutual self-interest, because it has to. Right now, the percentage of Latino youngsters and young adults who are finishing a 4-year college degree trails behind the American average by a great deal. And that was one thing when we were 1 out of 20 Americans or 1 out of 10 Americans. But by 2050, we'll be close to 1 out of 3. And if that degree completion number remains so far behind, this will be a poorer country because the workforce will be made up of a larger percentage of black and brown workers who aren't being properly trained to take the high-wage, high-skilled jobs of the future. So I think America, out of self-interest, I know I want my Social Security check to be funded in the 2030s and 2040s by smart, well-paid workers, and we'll make sure those people are well-educated and productive. But as we saw in the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Pennsylvania, and the chant, Charlottesville, Virginia, and the chant, "You will not replace us," America is not going to get to that multicultural future without a little bit of a family fight. And there are a lot of Americans made really uncomfortable by the fact that in 2050, more people here will trace their ancestry to Africa, Asia, and Latin America than to Europe for the first time. I think we'll eventually get that. We'll eventually, as we always have, we wouldn't have imagined that we could have sustained this level of immigration that we've had over the last 55 years. But we did. Since the laws changed in the mid-'60s and opened up the world to immigration from other parts of the world besides Europe, we eventually got the hang of it. There have been some fits and starts, obviously, now with the Trump era limitations on legal immigration and the terrible stories of people making it to the border, trying to escape violence and privation in Latin America. Look, we still have a lot of work to do. But I think we have a bright future, and the country has a bright future, but there's going to be some tension along the way.
Right. Many thanks for taking the time to speak with us on behalf of the Wilson Center. Many, many thanks. Muchas gracias.
El placer es mío. Gracias.